Dusk, the suburbs of Birmingham, a row of terraced houses along South Road, built sometime in the Victorian era, quiet now except for the occasional passing car. Behind one of these houses, in a small back garden where children might have once played and vegetables grown, something lies buried, not treasure in the usual sense, not bones, something stranger. In 1996, archaeologists from a television program called Time Team came here with shovels and ground-penetrating radar. They were looking for ghosts made of brick and iron. What they found, buried under roughly 30 feet of earth and rubble, were the foundations of a building that most historians had assumed was lost forever. A tunnel, built to house a drive shaft powered by steam. A room where workers once made shoe buckles by the thousands. The bones of what was once called, without exaggeration, the largest hardware manufactory in the world. The Soho Manufactory operated here from 1766 to 1848. 82 years. In that time, this single building helped launch the Industrial Revolution, employed over 1,000 workers, pioneered the assembly line more than a century before Henry Ford was born, minted coins for nations across the globe, and hosted the most brilliant collection of mines 18th century Britain ever produced. Its founder boasted to visitors that he sold what all the world desires to have, power. And yet today, almost nobody knows it existed. This is the forgotten story of the factory that invented the modern world, where it came from, what it made, the people who built it and worked in it, the ideas born inside its walls, and how something so significant could simply disappear, swallowed by time and housing developments and the peculiar amnesia of history. The question is not just what happened to the Soho Manufactory. The question is what happens to any revolution once the revolution is over. But before we reach the origins, consider what it took to run a factory like this in the 1780s. Consider what it meant to employ 700 people under one roof, in an age when most manufacturing happened in homes and small workshops. Consider the logistics, the management, the sheer audacity of the enterprise. 700 workers, men, women, and children, because in the 18th century, labor knew no age limits. They arrived at dawn and worked until dusk, 6 days a week, their hands blackened with metal dust, their lungs filling with fumes from the furnaces and the mercury used in gilding. Some of them were skilled craftsmen who had served 7-year apprenticeships. Others were laborers who performed the same repetitive task hour after hour, day after day, their bodies becoming extensions of the machines they operated. What did they earn? Records from the Soho Manufactory's insurance scheme, one of the earliest workplace insurance systems in the world, tell us that wages ranged from a few shillings per week for apprentices to several pounds for skilled masters. Every worker who earned 2 shillings and sixpence or more was required to join the Soho Friendly Society, paying 1/60th of their wages into a fund that would support them in case of injury or illness. The scheme was revolutionary for its time, a recognition that workers were not merely expendable resources, but assets worth protecting. There were rules, of course. A worker found guilty of indecency or keeping a dirty shop would be fined 1 shilling. A committee member who failed to attend meetings faced penalties. Workers who faked illness to claim benefits or who worked elsewhere while supposedly sick were punished. Senior staff who kept tips from wealthy visitors instead of putting them in the treasure box faced consequences. The system balanced care with discipline, protection with control. It was, in miniature, a model for the industrial welfare systems that would emerge over the next 2 centuries. But who were these workers? Their names have mostly been lost to history. We know that Francis Eggington worked as a decorator of japanned wares and later became one of the most celebrated stained glass painters of his generation. We know that William Murdoch, the Cornish engineer who invented gaslighting, spent decades at Soho and eventually became a partner in the firm. We know that young apprentices came from across the Midlands, drawn by the reputation of the factory and the promise of learning a trade. Most, however, remain anonymous. They made the buttons and buckles that adorned Georgian gentlemen. They polished the silver that graced aristocratic tables. They struck the coins that paid the wages of workers in distant lands. And then they went home to cramped houses in the industrial quarters of Birmingham, their contribution to history unmarked and unremembered. This is always the paradox of industrial archaeology. We celebrate the entrepreneurs and inventors, the Boltons and Watts, whose names appear in history books. We forget the hundreds, the thousands, the millions who actually did the work. The Soho Manufactory was not built by Matthew Boulton's vision alone. It was built by the labor of people whose names we will never know. The story begins, as so many British stories do, with an ambitious young man and a small inheritance. Matthew Bolton was born in Birmingham in 1728, the son of a buckle maker. This detail matters more than it might seem. Birmingham in the mid-18th century was not London. It was not Oxford or Cambridge. It had no cathedral, no university, no ancient charter. What Birmingham had was metal. The city sat at the heart of England's metalworking region, surrounded by iron foundries and coal mines, and small workshops where skilled craftsmen produced what were called toys. Not playthings for children. Toys, in the language of the time, meant small metal objects: buttons, buckles, snuff boxes, watch chains, sword hilts, anything that required precision work in brass or steel or silver. These were the consumer goods of the Georgian era, the everyday luxuries that a growing middle class was hungry to buy. Bolton inherited his father's buckle business in 1759 at the age of 31. He was already restless. He had spent years managing the workshop, improving processes, expanding the range of products. But the family business was limited by the same constraints that limited every small workshop in Birmingham: space, power, and ambition. The workshop could only accommodate so many craftsmen. The machines could only be driven by human hands and feet. And the market, Bolton believed, was far larger than any single workshop could satisfy. Among the products Bolton sought to make in his new facility were sterling silver plate for those able to afford it, and old Sheffield plate, silver sheet fused with copper sheet, for those less well off. Bolton and his father had long made small silver items, but there is no record of large items in either silver or Sheffield plate being made in Birmingham before Bolton did so. To make items such as candlesticks more cheaply than the London competition, the firm made many items out of thin, die-stamped sections, which were shaped and joined together. But there was a problem. To sell sterling silver legally, items had to be assayed and hallmarked at an official assay office. The nearest offices were in London or Chester, both inconveniently distant from Birmingham. Sending silver to be tested and marked added time and expense to every transaction. Worse, the London silversmiths viewed Birmingham as a threat and had no incentive to make things easy. Bolton decided to fight for his own assay office. In 1773, he led a campaign to petition Parliament for the establishment of assay offices in Birmingham and Sheffield. The London silversmiths opposed the measure vigorously, warning that provincial makers would produce inferior goods that would damage the reputation of British silver. Bolton organized a counter-campaign, mobilizing the metalworkers of Birmingham and their supporters. The battle was fierce but brief. In 1773, Parliament passed acts establishing assay offices in both Birmingham and Sheffield. The Birmingham Assay Office opened the following year in a building that still stands today, making it one of the oldest surviving institutions associated with the Soho enterprise. Every piece of sterling silver made in Birmingham since then has been tested and marked there, its anchor symbol a direct legacy of Bolton's campaign. The fight for the assay office reveals something important about Bolton's character. He was not content merely to work within existing systems. When those systems impeded his ambitions, he worked to change them. He understood that industrial success required not just technical innovation, but also political and institutional change. He was, in modern terms, an entrepreneur who shaped his environment rather than merely responding to it. Towards the end of the 18th century, Bolton and his followers expanded production at the Soho Manufactory to include shoe buckles and seals, marking Birmingham's rise as a center for both silver plate and mass-produced metal goods. He wanted something bigger. He wanted a factory. The word factory is worth pausing on. In 1759, the concept barely existed. Manufacturing was done in homes and small workshops. A master craftsman might employ a handful of apprentices and journeymen, producing goods by hand using techniques passed down through generations. The idea of bringing hundreds of workers together under a single roof, organizing their labor into specialized tasks, and driving machines with something other than human muscle was genuinely revolutionary. It was also, in many ways, untested. There were precedents. John Lombe's silk mill at Derby had been operational since 1721, using water power to drive throwing machines that twisted silk thread. By 1746, a brass works at Warmley near Bristol was running an integrated operation where raw material entered at one end and finished goods emerged from the other. But these were exceptions, experiments at the edge of what was possible. What Bolton envisioned was something more comprehensive, a manufactory that could produce every kind of metal good, from the cheapest button to the finest silverware. all under one roof. In 1761, he found his site. 2 miles northwest of Birmingham's centre, on Handsworth Heath, there was a small cottage and a water-driven rolling mill sitting on a brook called Hockley Brook. The brook was not impressive. It was, in fact, little more than a stream. But it could power a water wheel, and the land was available for lease. Bolton took it. What he built over the next 5 years was unprecedented. Working with the Wyatt family of architects from nearby Lichfield, Bolton designed and constructed a factory complex that visitors would later compare to a palace. The main building, completed in 1766, was a Palladian structure with classical columns and elegant proportions, deliberately designed to look nothing like the grimy workshops of Birmingham's industrial quarter. This was a statement of intent. Bolton was not just making goods. He was making a new kind of enterprise, one that combined manufacturing with what we might now call branding. The layout was revolutionary. 4 squares of buildings surrounded open courtyards with workshops arranged according to function. Raw materials entered at one end. Finished products emerged from the other. In between, workers performed specialized tasks in sequence, each contributing their particular skill to a product that passed from hand to hand. Metal was rolled in one building, cut in another, stamped in a third, polished in a fourth, assembled in a fifth. This was the assembly line principle, though the phrase would not be coined for another century and a half. The factory became a destination. Visitors came from across Europe to see the wonder of Soho, to meet the famous Matthew Bolton, and to witness for themselves what industrial organization could achieve. They arrived by carriage and on horseback, the wealthy and the curious, aristocrats and engineers, philosophers and merchants. Bolton welcomed them all, conducting personal tours through the workshops, explaining the processes, demonstrating the machines. Among the visitors was James Boswell, the biographer of Samuel Johnson. Johnson himself visited Soho and was impressed, though in his characteristic manner he found something to criticize. Others were more unreservedly enthusiastic. The factory appeared in travelers' accounts and guidebooks, described in terms that verged on the rapturous. Here was the future, manufactured before their eyes. But the tours were also a risk. Industrial espionage was a constant concern in the 18th century. Competitors sent agents to sketch machines and note processes. Some visitors pocketed samples or bribed workers for information. Bolton eventually had to impose restrictions, finding senior staff who kept tips from visitors instead of depositing them in the company treasury, presumably as a way of discouraging special favors. In an engraving from 1781, we can see the Soho Manufactory as visitors would have approached it. A handsome Palladian building, 3 stories tall, with classical columns and elegant proportions. Carriages and horses on the drive, their wealthy occupants arriving for a tour. The mill pool in the foreground, reflecting the building's facade. Smoke rising from the chimneys, the visible sign of the work within. This image was consciously crafted. Bolton understood what we would now call public relations. He wanted the world to see Soho not as a grimy workshop, but as a palace of industry, a demonstration that manufacturing could be conducted with taste and elegance. The classical architecture, the landscaped grounds, the careful staging of the factory tour, all of these were designed to impress, to persuade, to sell. And sell they did. Orders flowed in from across Europe and beyond. The reputation of Soho grew until the factory became synonymous with British industrial excellence. When Catherine the Great of Russia wanted fine metalwork, she bought from Soho. When King George III needed new coinage machinery, he turned to Soho. The factory's products found their way into palaces and manor houses, into the cabinets of collectors and the drawing rooms of the fashionable. By 1766, Bolton had erected what he called, with characteristic confidence, the largest hardware manufactory in the world. The claim was probably true. The Soho Manufactory, as it came to be known, employed between 600 and 700 workers at its peak, at a time when most Birmingham workshops had fewer than a dozen. It produced buttons and buckles and boxes and japanned ware. It produced sterling silver and Sheffield plate. It produced ormolu, a technique for gilding bronze that required amalgamating gold with mercury, a process so toxic that workers rarely survived it for long. It produced clocks and candelabras and vases of such quality that they graced the palaces of European royalty. Let us pause on this inventory, because it reveals something about the ambition and range of the Soho enterprise. Buttons, the simplest product, but perhaps the most essential. Every coat, every waistcoat, every pair of breeches required buttons. A prosperous gentleman might own dozens of garments, each requiring dozens of buttons. The market was enormous, and Bolton understood that scale mattered. By standardizing designs and streamlining production, he could produce buttons faster and cheaper than any competitor while maintaining quality. Buckles. Shoe buckles, knee buckles, belt buckles, stock buckles for neckwear. In the Georgian era, buckles were not merely functional. They were fashion statements, status symbols, displays of taste and wealth. Bolton produced buckles in steel, in brass, in silver, in gold. He produced buckles set with paste gems that sparkled like diamonds. He produced buckles so elaborate that a single pair might cost more than a working family earned in a year. Sheffield plate. This was one of Bolton's most commercially successful innovations. Traditional silver was expensive, affordable only to the wealthy. Sheffield plate, invented in the 1740s, fused a thin layer of silver to a copper base, creating an object that looked like sterling but cost a fraction of the price. Bolton's factory was probably the first outside Sheffield to produce this material on a large scale, and his techniques for shaping and decorating it were unmatched. A middle-class family could now own silver-looking candlesticks, teapots, serving dishes, all the accoutrements of gentility at a manageable price. Ormolu. This was the pinnacle of Bolton's craft, and the most dangerous. Ormolu involved coating bronze objects with a thin layer of gold using a process called fire gilding. The gold was dissolved in mercury to form an amalgam, then painted onto the bronze surface. When heated, the mercury evaporated, leaving a permanent gold coating. The objects produced were stunning: candelabras, vases, clock cases, decorative mounts for furniture and ceramics. They were also death sentences for the workers who made them. Mercury poisoning is slow and terrible. The metal accumulates in the body over time, attacking the nervous system, the kidneys, the brain. Workers who handled mercury amalgam developed tremors, memory loss, mood swings, tooth loss, and eventually dementia. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from the mercury used in hat making, but gilders suffered the same fate. At Soho, Ormolu workers were among the highest paid because their careers would inevitably be short. Bolton knew this. Everyone knew this. But there was no alternative process, and demand for ormolu was intense. Aristocrats across Europe wanted Soho's gilded candelabras and mantel clocks. Catherine the Great of Russia, Marie Antoinette of France, George III of England, all owned Bolton products. The factory's reputation depended on its ability to supply these luxury goods, whatever the human cost. Only 2 pairs of the famous Apollo and Diana candelabra were ever made. Standing 12 inches tall, cast in bronze and marble, gilded with that deadly mercury process, they represented the absolute peak of Soho's artistic achievement. 1 pair is now in Soho House Museum. They are beautiful. They are also monuments to the unnamed workers who died making them. But producing goods was only part of Bolton's ambition. He also wanted to produce ideas. In the summer of 1765, something happened that would change not just Bolton's factory, but the entire trajectory of industrial history. A young physician named William Small recently arrived from Virginia, where he had been a professor at the College of William and Mary, was introduced to Bolton by the American polymath Benjamin Franklin. Small was brilliant, curious, and connected to a network of the most innovative minds in Britain. He and Bolton became friends. Through Small, Bolton was introduced to Erasmus Darwin, a physician and poet from Lichfield who had interests ranging from botany to mechanics to evolutionary theory. Darwin, in turn, introduced Bolton to Josiah Wedgwood, the potter whose factory at Etruria would revolutionize the ceramics industry. These connections multiplied. By the late 1760s, Bolton was at the center of an informal network of inventors, scientists, industrialists, and philosophers who would meet regularly to discuss their ideas and experiments. They called themselves the Lunar Society because they met on the Monday nearest the full moon. The moonlight, they joked, helped them find their way home along Birmingham's dark and often dangerous roads. They also called themselves, with typical Georgian wit, the Lunatics. The core members, over time, included about 14 men. Darwin, with his thundering poetry and revolutionary ideas about evolution that would later inspire his grandson, Charles. Wedgwood, whose pottery factories were as innovative as Bolton's metalworks. Joseph Priestley, the radical minister and chemist who would discover oxygen and invent carbonated water. James Keir, the chemist who pioneered soap manufacturing. William Withering, the physician who introduced digitalis as a treatment for heart conditions. Samuel Galton, the arms manufacturer whose descendants would include Charles Darwin's wife and Francis Galton, the founder of statistics. And James Watt. Watt was a Scottish instrument maker who had been working on a problem that had vexed engineers for decades: the inefficiency of the steam engine. The existing design, invented by Thomas Newcomen in 1712, worked by alternately filling a cylinder with steam and then cooling it with water to create a vacuum that drove a piston. The problem was obvious. Every cycle, the cylinder had to be heated and cooled, wasting enormous amounts of energy. Watt's insight, which came to him during a Sunday walk in 1765, was that the steam could be condensed in a separate chamber, keeping the main cylinder hot at all times. The separate condenser would eventually reduce fuel consumption by roughly 75%. But insights are cheap. Building a working engine was expensive. Watt had spent years trying to commercialize his invention, burning through money and patience while struggling with the practical challenges of precision engineering. Cylinders had to be bored to tolerances that existing technology could barely achieve. Materials had to withstand pressures and temperatures that few craftsmen understood. By the early 1770s, Watt's original backer, the Scottish industrialist John Roebuck, had gone bankrupt. The improved steam engine existed only as drawings and a half-finished prototype. Enter Matthew Boulton. Boulton had been interested in steam power since at least 1766, when he had begun corresponding with Benjamin Franklin about the possibility of using steam engines to drive his factory machines. The Soho Manufactory was powered by water from Hockley Brook, but water was unreliable. Droughts in summer, floods in spring, ice in winter, any of these could stop the water wheel and halt production. A steam engine, in theory, could run continuously, regardless of weather or season. In 1767, when Watt first visited Birmingham, he was shown around the Soho Manufactory by William Small and Erasmus Darwin while Boulton was away on business. The visit made an impression. Here was a factory with the skilled craftsmen, the precision equipment, and the capital resources that Watt needed to complete his engine. Here, too, was an entrepreneur with the vision to see what steam power might become. When Roebuck went bankrupt in 1773, Boulton acquired his share of Watt's patent in exchange for debts owed. In 1774, Watt moved from Scotland to Birmingham. In 1775, Boulton secured an Act of Parliament extending Watt's patent until 1800, giving them 25 years to recoup their investment. The partnership of Boulton and Watt was born. What followed was one of the most productive collaborations in industrial history. Boulton provided the capital, the manufacturing capacity, the marketing genius, and the relentless optimism. Watt provided the engineering brilliance, the meticulous attention to detail, and the chronic pessimism that made him triple-check every calculation. They were, in many ways, opposites. Boulton was gregarious, confident, always looking for new opportunities. Watt was introverted, anxious, prone to depression and headaches, and long periods of self-doubt. Together, they were unstoppable. Consider the scale of what they accomplished. When Watt arrived in Birmingham in 1774, his steam engine existed only as a prototype and a patent. The prototype barely worked. The patent was valuable only if they could build engines that customers would actually buy. Everything depended on solving a series of fiendishly difficult technical problems. The first problem was the cylinder. For the engine to work efficiently, the piston had to fit tightly inside the cylinder, with minimal leakage of steam around the edges. But machining a cylinder to the necessary tolerances was beyond the capability of most 18th century manufacturers. The solution came from John Wilkinson, an ironmaster whose boring machine, originally designed for cannon making, could produce cylinders accurate to within a few hundredths of an inch. Without Wilkinson's precision, there would have been no Watt engine. The second problem was materials. The engine operated at temperatures and pressures that stressed metal in ways that earlier machines never had. Pipes had to be sealed. Valves had to open and close reliably. Pumps had to withstand constant use. Every component had to be designed, tested, redesigned, and tested again. Watt spent years on these details, his letters to Boulton filled with frustrations and setbacks and occasional breakthroughs. The third problem was installation. A Boulton and Watt engine was not something you could buy off the shelf. Each engine was custom designed for its specific application, whether pumping water from a mine or driving machinery in a mill. Teams of skilled workers had to travel to the customer's site, assemble the engine from components shipped from Soho, connect it to the local infrastructure, and train the operators in its use. This was engineering consulting as much as manufacturing. The first Boulton and Watt engines were installed in 1776. They were used to pump water out of mines, which was the original purpose of the Newcomen engine and remained the most obvious application. But Boulton had larger ambitions. He wanted engines that could power factory machines, not just pumps. That meant converting the up and down motion of a piston into the rotary motion needed to turn wheels and drive shafts. The solution took years to develop. A simple crank, the obvious answer, was blocked by a patent held by a rival inventor who refused to license it. Watt and Boulton had to invent an alternative, the sun and planet gear, which converted linear motion to rotation through an ingenious arrangement of interlocking wheels. By 1782, they had developed a double-acting engine where steam pushed the piston in both directions, doubling the power output. By 1788, they had added a governor that automatically regulated engine speed. By the time their patent expired in 1800, they had sold almost 500 engines and transformed the technological landscape of Britain. The engines were manufactured not at the Soho Manufactory, but at the Soho Foundry, a separate facility established in 1795, about a mile away in Smethwick. The foundry was planned with a degree of sophistication unprecedented for a factory of its time. Its products were produced from standardized interchangeable parts, reducing the need for skilled supervision and simplifying repair. Production processes were broken down into small tasks, enabling specialization. Workers and materials flowed through a series of workshops arranged along the sequence of production, minimizing wasted time and motion. This was not just manufacturing. This was scientific management, a century before Frederick Winslow Taylor coined the term. The economist Eric Roll, studying the Soho Foundry in the 1930s, concluded that neither Taylor nor Ford nor any other modern expert devised anything that had not already been practiced at Soho. Among the men who worked at the foundry was William Murdoch, a Cornish engineer who had been installing Boulton and Watt engines in mines since the 1770s. Murdoch was an inventor in his own right, constantly tinkering with new devices and improvements. In 1792, working in his spare time, he developed a method of producing flammable gas from coal and using it for illumination. He lit his own home with gas and later demonstrated the technique at Soho. Gas lighting would eventually transform the world, making it possible to extend productive hours beyond daylight, to illuminate factories and streets and homes with a clean, steady light. Murdoch did not invent gas lighting from scratch. Others had experimented with the same principle, but he made it practical. And he did so while employed at Soho, as part of the culture of innovation that Boulton and Watt had created. Murdoch was made a partner in the firm in 1810, the year after Boulton's death. He remained with the company for another 20 years, retiring at the age of 76. His gas lighting patents and techniques spread across Britain and then the world, another Soho innovation that became so ubiquitous it was forgotten. The steam engine made many things possible. It powered textile mills, enabling the explosive growth of the cotton industry. It drove blast furnaces and hammers in ironworks. It pumped water from ever deeper coal mines. But at Soho, it also made possible something that might seem trivial by comparison, but was, in its own way, equally revolutionary. It made possible the minting of coins. By the 1780s, Britain's coinage was in crisis. The Royal Mint had produced almost no copper coins for decades, leaving the economy desperately short of the small change needed to pay workers and conduct everyday transactions. The gap was filled by counterfeiters, whose fake coins flooded the market. In 1787, when the Royal Mint tested a sample of circulating halfpennies, only 8% were genuine. Birmingham, with its skilled metal workers and lax oversight, was a major center of counterfeiting. Some forgers were brazen enough to hang signs in their windows advertising their services. Boulton saw an opportunity. If he could apply the precision and power of steam-driven machinery to coin production, he could make coins that were impossible to counterfeit. In 1788, he established the Soho Mint within his manufactory, installing 8 coining presses of his own design, each driven by steam and capable of striking 70 to 85 coins per minute. It was the first steam-powered mint in the world. The coins produced at Soho were unlike anything seen before. They were perfectly round, precisely weighted, with deep, sharp impressions that no hand-operated press could match. The edges were inscribed with lettering to prevent clipping. The designs, created by the German engraver Konrad Heinrich Kukler, were works of art. A dignified portrait of George III on one side, a maritime Britannia on the other, seated on an island surrounded by waves to symbolize Britain's naval supremacy. In 1797, after years of lobbying, Bolton finally received a contract from the government to produce copper coins for general circulation. The result was the famous cartwheel penny and twopenny, so called because of their large size and distinctive broad rims. The penny weighed 1 ounce and measured 36 millimeters in diameter. The twopenny weighed 2 ounces and measured 41 millimeters. They were massive, impractical, and beautiful. Over 45 million were struck in 2 years. The scale of this operation is worth appreciating. 45 million coins. Each one had to be cut from rolled copper sheet, struck between precisely engraved dies, inspected for defects, counted, and packaged for distribution. The Soho Mint employed its own workforce, separate from the main manufactory, running day and night to meet the government's orders. The steam engines that drove the presses consumed tons of coal. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder of metal striking metal that could be heard across the surrounding countryside. And yet, this was only part of what the mint produced. Between 1797 and 1809, Soho struck coins for Sierra Leone, for the Russian Empire, for the East India Company's territories in India and Southeast Asia. It produced tokens for private merchants across Britain, filling the gap left by the shortage of official small change. It struck commemorative medals for military victories, scientific achievements, royal jubilees. The Admiral Gardner was an East India Company ship that sailed from England in 1808, carrying, among other cargo, a consignment of copper coins minted at Soho for use in Madras. The ship wrecked on the Goodwin Sands off the coast of Kent in January 1809, and its cargo, including the coins, sank to the bottom. In 1985, nearly 2 centuries later, divers recovered thousands of these coins from the wreck. They were still in good condition, the Soho workmanship evident in every detail. You can buy them today, these coins that Matthew Bolton made and the ocean preserved, tangible connections to a vanished world. But the Soho Mint did far more than produce British coppers. It minted coins for the East India Company for use in India and Southeast Asia. It struck tokens for private merchants across Britain. It produced medals commemorating naval victories, including a medal for the Battle of Trafalgar that Bolton manufactured at his own expense and gave to every sailor who had fought in the battle. When the Royal Mint finally modernized in 1805, it was Bolton who supplied the steam-powered machinery. The Soho Mint had not just produced coins, it had revolutionized the technology of coinage itself. And all of this happened within the walls of a single factory complex, on the edge of a provincial city, driven by the energy and vision of one extraordinary entrepreneur and the brilliant minds he gathered around him. The Luna Society meetings continued through the 1770s and 1780s, usually at Soho House, the elegant Georgian mansion that Bolton had expanded from the original cottage on the site. The dining room, later known as the Luna Room, was where the members gathered to eat, drink, argue, and experiment. Darwin might demonstrate a new mechanical device. Priestley might describe his latest chemical discoveries. Wedgwood might pass around samples of a new ceramic glaze. Watt might explain the challenges of boring a precise cylinder. The conversations ranged from the practical to the philosophical, from industrial processes to evolutionary theory, from chemistry to politics. Imagine being present at one of these meetings. The year is 1788. You have been invited by Matthew Bolton, your host, a man in his late 50s with a commanding presence and an infectious enthusiasm. You arrive at Soho House as the sun sets, the full moon rising over the landscaped grounds, its light guiding you along the drive. Inside, the dining room is warm and well lit. A fire burns in the grate. The table is set with silver and Sheffield plate, all made in the factory next door. Around the table sit perhaps 8 or 10 men, some in their middle years, some elderly, all animated by conversation. There is Erasmus Darwin, the physician and poet, vast in body and intellect, his stammer not slowing his torrent of ideas. He is describing a canal lock he has designed, or perhaps his theory of how plants reproduce, or maybe his speculation that all life descended from a single common ancestor, a notion his grandson Charles will make famous 60 years hence. There is Joseph Priestley, the radical minister, thin and intense, explaining his latest experiments with gases. He has isolated a substance he calls dephlogisticated air, which makes flames burn brighter and keeps mice alive longer in sealed containers. We call it oxygen now. He has also figured out how to infuse water with fixed air, creating what we call soda water. Jacob Schweppe will soon commercialize the idea, supplying the Soho philosophers with fizzy water by the cartload. There is James Watt, quieter than the others, listening more than speaking, his mind constantly working on the problems of his engines. He is a melancholy man, prone to headaches and dark moods, but his engineering genius is unmatched. When he does speak, the others listen. There is Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, who has revolutionized ceramics manufacturing, much as Bolton has revolutionized metalworking. His factory at Etruria, modeled on Soho, produces jasperware and basaltes and queensware for markets around the world. He is also, incidentally, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who will marry his daughter. And there is Bolton himself, presiding over the gathering with easy hospitality. He has arranged for demonstrations after dinner, perhaps a model of a new engine, or a display of the latest ormolu production, or a scientific experiment that Priestley has designed. The food is excellent, the wine flows freely, and the conversation continues until the small hours. This is how revolutions happen, not in parliaments or on battlefields, but in dining rooms, among friends, over good food and wine. The Lunar Society had no formal structure, no charter, no officers. It was simply a group of brilliant people who enjoyed each other's company and pushed each other to think bigger. They were, in the language of our own time, a network. They were also quite simply friends. These were men who believed in progress. They believed that human reason, applied systematically to the problems of nature and society, could improve the condition of mankind. They believed in education, in religious tolerance, in political reform. Many of them were dissenters, members of Protestant denominations outside the Church of England who were legally barred from attending Oxford or Cambridge or holding public office. Their exclusion from the establishment made them outsiders, and their outsider status made them innovators. But their progressive beliefs also made them enemies. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted across the Channel. To many in Britain, it was a hopeful sign, a vindication of the principles of liberty and rational reform that the Lunar men championed. To others, it was a terrifying warning of what happened when radicals were allowed to challenge the established order. As the revolution grew more violent, as the guillotine began its work in Paris, opinion in Britain polarized. Reformers were increasingly seen as dangerous subversives. Dissenters were viewed with suspicion. Joseph Priestley was a particular target. He was outspoken, prolific, and seemingly incapable of keeping his more provocative opinions to himself. He had written pamphlets attacking the Church of England. He had publicly supported the French Revolution. He had suggested, in one famous passage, that reformers were laying gunpowder grain by grain under the old building of error and superstition. To his opponents, this sounded like a threat. On July 14, 1791, the second anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, a group of Birmingham gentlemen gathered at a hotel to celebrate the French Revolution. Priestley was not present, but his name was on everyone's lips. By evening, a mob had formed in the streets, their cry "Church and King." They marched first to the hotel, then to Priestley's chapel, then to his home. Over the next 3 days, they burned 4 dissenting chapels, 27 houses, and several businesses. They destroyed Priestley's library and laboratory, decades of scientific work reduced to ashes. They were only stopped when cavalry arrived from Nottingham on the 4th day. The scale of destruction was staggering. Historians estimate the damage at around £60,000, the equivalent of many millions today. But the financial losses were almost beside the point. What was destroyed was irreplaceable. Priestley's scientific instruments, his notes and correspondence, his collection of books, the accumulated work of a lifetime spent pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. The mob had not merely attacked a building, they had tried to erase a mind. Who were these rioters? Contemporary accounts describe them as working men, laborers, and artisans who shouted "Church and King" as they went about their destruction. But behind them, many suspected, were more respectable figures, local magistrates and church officials who had organized the violence and directed the mob toward its targets. A core group of about 30 men who stayed sober throughout the rioting and could not be bribed to stop seemed to be following a prepared list of victims. Some of those attacked had been warned days in advance, suggesting premeditation. The riots exposed fractures that had been building for years. Birmingham had seemed on the surface to be a harmonious community where dissenters and Anglicans worked together for the common good. Bolton employed workers of all religious backgrounds. The Lunar Society included men of various faiths. But beneath this cooperation simmered resentments and fears that the French Revolution brought to the surface. Priestley fled first to London, then across the Atlantic to America, where he spent his remaining years in Pennsylvania. He never returned to Birmingham. His scientific career effectively ended with the destruction of his laboratory. He continued to write and think, but the momentum of discovery was broken. The Soho Manufactory was on the rioters' list, but they never reached it. Bolton and Watt had armed their workers and prepared to defend the factory. Some accounts say they mounted a cannon at the gates. Whether or not this is true, the factory was not attacked. But the damage to the Lunar Society was irreparable. Priestley fled first to London, then to America, where he spent the rest of his life. Other members withdrew from public activity. The spirit of optimistic collaboration that had characterized the society was gone. In a poignant ceremony in August 1813, the sons of the original members gathered to divide the society's library of scientific books. They drew lots to see who would take which volumes. It was the final act of an institution that had helped shape the modern world. What happened to the Soho Manufactory after the glory years of the Bolton and Watt partnership? The answer is a slow, unmemorable decline, the kind of ending that befalls most institutions once the founders are gone and the world has moved on. Bolton retired in 1800, the same year that the steam engine patent expired. His son, Matthew Robinson Bolton, took over the business. The younger Bolton was competent but not visionary. One of his first acts was to end the public tours of the manufactory that his father had offered to visitors from across Europe. The tours had been a source of pride for the elder Bolton, a way of demonstrating the achievements of British industry. They had also, admittedly, been a security risk. Industrial spies had visited Soho, trying to steal Bolton's techniques and designs. The younger Bolton decided that secrecy was more important than publicity. Perhaps he was right, in purely commercial terms. But something was lost with the closure of those tours. The elder Bolton had understood that the Soho Manufactory was more than a business. It was a demonstration, a proof of what British industry could achieve. The visitors who came from France and Germany and Russia and America took away not just memories but ideas. They went home and built their own factories, their own workshops, their own industrial revolutions. Soho was not just making products, it was making the future. The younger Bolton seems not to have grasped this. He ran the business efficiently enough, but without the expansive vision that had characterized his father's leadership. The manufactory continued to produce buttons and buckles and silver plate, but it was no longer at the cutting edge of innovation. The center of gravity had shifted to the Soho foundry in Smethwick, where the steam engine business continued to thrive. The elder Bolton continued to run the Soho Mint until his death in 1809 at the age of 80. He had lived to see his engine's power factories across Britain and Europe. He had seen his coins circulate on 3 continents. He had entertained princes and philosophers in his dining room. His funeral was attended by 600 people, and his monument in St. Mary's Church, Handsworth, was sculpted by the famous artist John Flaxman. Watt outlived his partner by 10 years, dying in 1819 at the age of 83. He had spent his retirement tinkering with new inventions, none of which matched the significance of the steam engine. His workshop, preserved almost exactly as he left it, is now in the Science Museum in London. It is a modest space filled with tools and instruments and half-finished projects, the intimate workspace of a genius. Visitors can peer through glass at the bench where Watt sat, the drawers where he kept his materials, the models of engines and inventions scattered across every surface. But Bolton left no such workshop. His monument is not a preserved room, but a vanished factory. His legacy is not a collection of tools, but a system, a way of organizing human effort that transformed the world. What manner of man was Matthew Bolton? The historical record gives us glimpses but no complete portrait. He was ambitious, certainly, driven by a restless energy that never let him rest on his achievements. He was sociable, a natural host who brought together the brilliant minds of his age. He was generous, supporting Watt through years of financial difficulty, funding experiments and enterprises that might never pay off. He was also, by all accounts, a loving family man, though his family life was marked by tragedy. His first wife, Mary Robinson, whom he married in 1749, died in 1759, leaving him with a young daughter. He married her sister Anne the following year, and Anne bore him 2 children who survived to adulthood and several who did not. Neither his son Matthew Robinson Bolton nor his daughter Anne enjoyed robust health. The son was often ill and struggled in school before joining the family business. the daughter suffered from a diseased leg that limited her activities. Bolton's letters reveal the strain of his absences on family life. He spent months at a time in London, lobbying Parliament, negotiating contracts, managing the complex web of partnerships and enterprises that made up his business empire. In January 1780, he wrote to his wife, "Nothing could in the least palliate this long, this cold, this very distant separation from my dearest wife and children, but the certain knowledge that I am preparing for their ease, happiness, and prosperity. And when that is the prize, I know no hardships that I would not encounter with to obtain it." The hardships were real. The Bolton and Watt partnership came close to bankruptcy more than once. Mine owners in Cornwall resented paying royalties for the improved engines and withheld payments. Patent disputes dragged through the courts. The capital requirements of the engine business strained even Bolton's considerable resources. There were years when the partnership was kept afloat only by the profits from the manufactory's other products and by the generosity of creditors who believed in the eventual success of the venture. But Bolton persevered. He lobbied, negotiated, innovated, adapted. He found new markets when old ones closed. He developed new products when old ones became obsolete. He maintained his network of relationships, his correspondence with scientists and engineers and aristocrats across Europe. He never stopped working, never stopped planning, never stopped dreaming of new enterprises. The Soho foundry, which had been established in 1795 to manufacture steam engines, continued to operate and thrive. It was a separate enterprise from the Soho Manufactory, located about a mile away in Smethwick, and it would continue producing engines for another century. Some of its buildings still stand today, protected as listed structures of historic importance. But the original Soho Manufactory, the building where buttons and buckles and silverware had been made, where the Lunar Society had met, where the world's first steam-powered mint had struck coins for nations around the globe, gradually wound down. By the 1840s, production had largely ceased. In 1848, the manufactory closed for good. In 1850, Bolton's grandson sold the site. In 1853, the buildings were demolished to make way for housing. The demolition was noted in the Birmingham Post with a mixture of regret and resignation. "This shrine of science, school of art, and temple of mechanics is now doomed," the newspaper wrote. "In a few weeks' time, all traces of the venerable and stately fame will be swept away, but its fame will live forevermore." The fame did not live forevermore. Within a generation, the Soho Manufactory had become a footnote. The houses built on its foundations were modest Victorian terraces, home to ordinary working families who had no idea what lay beneath their gardens. The name Soho survived in local street names and the nearby Soho Road, but few connected it to the vanished factory. By the 20th century, the Soho Manufactory was largely forgotten, remembered only by specialists in industrial history. It was not until 1996, when the Time Team archaeologists arrived with their cameras and their shovels, that the physical remains of the factory were rediscovered. Digging in back gardens along South Road, they found foundations and tunnels and artifacts. Fragments of the drive shaft that had once connected steam engines to machinery. Remnants of the rooms where buckles and coins had been made. The excavation was the first devoted entirely to industrial archaeology in the program's history. It brought the story of Soho back to public attention, briefly. The excavation was filmed over 3 days in April 1996 and broadcast the following year. The archaeologists, led by the detailed research of George Demidowich, using the magnificent Soho collection in Birmingham Central Library, knew exactly where to dig. Only particular gardens promised results, and only particular homeowners were willing to have their flower beds excavated for television. What they found exceeded expectations. The foundations of the principal building were intact, buried under roughly 10 meters of fill that had been deposited in the early 20th century. A tunnel for a drive shaft, originally 60 meters long, was traced and partially excavated. The junction where this tunnel met the tunnel from the steam engine room was discovered in one garden. Parts of the latchet building, where a type of springy buckle had been made before it was converted into the cutting-out room for the rebuilt mint in the 1820s, were uncovered in another. The finds were not spectacular in the way that Roman mosaics or medieval gold are spectacular. They were industrial, bricks and ironwork and the traces of machinery. But for those who understood what they were looking at, they were revelatory. Here was physical proof of the factory system in its infancy. Here were the foundations of a building that had changed the world. After the excavation, the gardens were filled in and replanted. The artifacts were catalogued and stored. The program was broadcast, watched by millions, and then forgotten. The foundations returned to their darkness, waiting for the next disturbance. And then, once again, the factory was forgotten. What survives today? Not much in physical terms. The Soho Foundry buildings in Smethwick still stand, owned by a company that makes weighing machines. The site is scheduled as a monument of national importance, but it is not open to the public. Soho House, Matthew Boulton's home, is a museum run by Birmingham Museums Trust. Visitors can see the lunar room where the society met, displays of silver and ormolu made in the manufactory, and the gardens that Boulton landscaped using more than 2,000 conifer trees. The garden is now less than half an acre, a fraction of its original size. The museum is modest, as befits a house rather than a factory. Visitors enter through a small reception area, pay a small admission fee, and are taken on a guided tour through the restored rooms. The guides, by all accounts, are excellent, knowledgeable, enthusiastic, skilled at bringing the past to life. But the house itself is not large, and a thorough tour takes only an hour or so. What do you see? The dining room, of course, where the lunatics gathered. The walls are painted in period colors, the furniture arranged as it might have been in Boulton's day. A table is set with silver and Sheffield plate from the manufactory's workshops. Portraits of the key figures hang on the walls. Boulton himself, painted by the fashionable artist William Beechey. Watt, looking characteristically anxious. The other lunar men in their wigs and cravats. In other rooms, display cases hold examples of the manufactory's products. Buttons in dozens of designs, plain and decorated, brass and steel, stamped and engraved, buckles of varying sizes and materials, watch chains and snuff boxes and sword hilts. The famous ormolu, candelabras and vases and clock cases, their gilding still bright after 2 centuries. And coins, the cartwheel pennies that Boulton fought so hard to produce, heavy in the hand, their edges still crisp. There is also a scale model of the Soho Manufactory, constructed from historical plans and illustrations. Looking at it, you can grasp the scale of the enterprise in a way that the surviving documents never quite convey. The main building, with its classical columns and elegant facade. The outbuildings where specialized work was done. The mill pool that provided water power before steam took over. The gardens that Boulton landscaped to screen his home from the noise and smoke of production. The model shows what is no longer there. The reality is the houses of South Road, the ordinary suburbs of a large industrial city. The contrast is striking, and perhaps that is the point. This is what happens to revolutions. They succeed so completely that they disappear. Soho House is open to the public, but opening hours are limited, and advance booking is often required. It attracts perhaps a few thousand visitors per year, a tiny fraction of the millions who visit the major London museums or the great country estates. Most people in Birmingham have never been there. Most people in Britain have never heard of it. And yet, in a sense, everyone has been shaped by what happened in this place. The steam engines that Watt designed and Boulton manufactured powered the Industrial Revolution. The factory system that Boulton pioneered became the model for industrial production worldwide. The principles of standardization and division of labor that were developed at Soho are still the basis of modern manufacturing. The very idea that a group of brilliant minds could come together, exchange ideas, and change the world through innovation. This too was demonstrated at Soho, in the dining room where the lunatics met. In 2011, the Bank of England issued a new £50 note. On the reverse was an image of the Soho Manufactory, along with portraits of Matthew Boulton and James Watt, and a depiction of the Whitbread steam engine, one of their early rotative engines that survives in a museum. The inscription beneath Boulton's portrait quoted his famous boast, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have, power." The inscription beneath Watt's portrait was equally characteristic. "I can think of nothing else but this machine." It was the first Bank of England note to feature 2 people on the reverse. It was also perhaps the most fitting memorial to a partnership that had changed the world. For about a decade, until the polymer notes featuring Alan Turing replaced it in 2021, millions of people carried images of Soho in their wallets and purses. Most of them presumably had no idea what they were looking at. What does it mean to forget a revolution? The Industrial Revolution is taught in schools and celebrated in museums and commemorated in countless books and documentaries. We know the broad outlines: steam power, factories, urbanization, the transformation of work and society. What we often miss is the specificity of it. The revolution happened in particular places, built by particular people for particular reasons. It happened at Soho. The numbers are worth considering. By 1800, Boulton and Watt had installed almost 500 steam engines in Britain and abroad. These engines powered textile mills, ironworks, breweries, flour mills, and countless other industrial operations. They pumped water from mines, allowing coal to be extracted from ever deeper seams. They generated, by one estimate, over 300,000 horsepower at their peak, a unit of measurement that Watt himself helped define. The Soho Mint struck over 45 million copper coins for Britain alone, plus millions more for foreign clients. The cartwheel pennies and twopences remained in circulation for decades, their distinctive design immediately recognizable. The machinery Boulton developed was sold to the Royal Mint and to mints around the world, establishing the standard for coin production that persisted into the 20th century. The workers of the Soho Manufactory produced buttons and buckles by the millions. They made Sheffield plate that democratized the display of silver on middle-class tables. They created ormolu that decorated palaces across Europe. They trained apprentices who went on to found their own enterprises, spreading the Soho methods and techniques across Britain and beyond. The Lunar Society, though small in membership, had outsized influence. Its members discovered oxygen, developed the theory of evolution, pioneered the chemistry of gases, invented new industrial processes, and pushed the boundaries of knowledge in a dozen different fields. They corresponded with leading thinkers across Europe and America, sharing ideas and techniques in an age before scientific journals and international conferences. All of this flowed from the Soho Manufactory, from the vision of one man and the collaboration of many. And yet today, the factory is forgotten, its physical remains buried under suburban housing, its story unknown to most who benefit from its innovations. Matthew Boulton was not just an entrepreneur. He was a visionary who understood that manufacturing could be organized on an unprecedented scale, that products could be designed for beauty as well as function, that innovation required bringing together diverse minds from different disciplines. He created not just a factory, but an ecosystem of creativity. James Watt was not just an inventor. He was a perfectionist whose obsessive attention to detail transformed a theoretical improvement into a practical technology. Without Boulton's ambition and resources, he might have spent his life as a frustrated craftsman in Scotland. Without Watt's engineering genius, Boulton might have spent his fortune on a failed experiment. The Lunar Society was not just a club. It was a prototype of the research networks and innovation hubs that would later drive scientific and technological progress. Darwin, Priestley, Wedgwood, Watt, Keir, Withering, all the others. They were colleagues and competitors, friends and rivals, men who pushed each other to think bigger and work harder and take risks. They were, in the language of our own time, an innovation cluster. And the Soho Manufactory itself was not just a building, it was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that industry could be organized on a scale previously unimaginable. It showed that quality and efficiency were not mutually exclusive. It pioneered techniques of mass production that would later be perfected by others. It was, in the most literal sense, a factory for the future. All of this is now buried under suburban housing in Birmingham. The machines are gone, melted down or scattered to museums. The workers are dust. The lunatics are names in history books. The coins they struck are collector's items, traded at auction for prices that would have astonished even Boulton. But maybe that is not the tragedy it seems to be. In 1862, as the Soho Manufactory was being demolished, a writer for the Birmingham Post noted that its fame will live forevermore. He was wrong, in the sense that most people today have never heard of Soho. But he was also right, in a deeper sense. The principles that Boulton and Watt and the Lunar Society pioneered, the integration of science and industry, the organization of labor, the application of power to production, these principles did live on. They became so fundamental to modern life that we no longer see them as innovations. They became invisible, like the air we breathe. Every factory in the world is a descendant of Soho. Every assembly line traces its lineage back to Boulton's workshops. Every steam turbine, every power plant, every engine of any kind owes something to Watt's separate condenser. The modern world was manufactured here, in a cluster of buildings on a heath outside Birmingham, by a group of men who called themselves lunatics and met by the light of the moon. We do not remember them, but we live in the world they made. The archaeologists from Time Team found something unexpected when they dug in those Birmingham gardens in 1996. They found that the foundations of the Soho Manufactory were remarkably well preserved. The brick walls were intact. The tunnel for the drive shaft was still there, buried under 10 meters of fill. The site had not been destroyed so much as buried, waiting. Perhaps that is the right metaphor for the history itself. Not lost, not destroyed, just buried, waiting for someone to dig. The residents of South Road still live above those foundations. The gardens where the archaeologists once dug have been filled in and replanted. Life goes on, as it always does, on top of the past. Somewhere beneath the roses and the vegetable patches, beneath the garden sheds and the children's playgrounds, the bones of Britain's first factory still lie in the dark. And the story waits to be told again. If you are standing in Birmingham today, you can visit Soho House and see where Matthew Boulton lived. You can walk through the rooms where the Lunar Society met. You can see the silver and ormolu that the workers made, the clocks and candelabras that once graced the homes of European aristocracy. You can stand in the garden, much smaller now than it was in Bolton's day, and imagine what it was like when 2,000 conifers stood here, screening the elegant house from the view of the noisy, smoky manufactory next door. What you cannot see is the factory itself. There is no monument on South Road, no plaque marking the spot where the Industrial Revolution began. The houses that replaced it are ordinary, unremarkable, indistinguishable from thousands of other Victorian terraces in cities across Britain. If you did not know what to look for, you would walk right past. Maybe that is fitting. The Soho Manufactory was never meant to be a monument. It was meant to be a working factory, a place where things were made. Its purpose was not to be remembered, but to produce buttons and buckles, silver and ormolu, steam engines and coins. It succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. And when its work was done, when the techniques it pioneered had spread to factories across the world, it was demolished and forgotten. We remember the pyramids because they were built to last forever. We forget the factories because they were built to work. But the work they did changed everything. The work they did made the modern world. One last image. In 1781, an artist made an engraving of the Soho Manufactory as seen from across the mill pool. It shows a handsome Palladian building, 3 stories tall, with classical columns and elegant proportions. In front of the building, on the drive that led to the entrance, there are carriages and horses and well-dressed visitors. These were the tourists who came from across Europe to see the famous manufactory and meet its famous owner. The engraving is now in the collection of Birmingham archives. It shows a building that no longer exists, in a landscape that has been utterly transformed. The mill pool is gone. The trees are gone. The handsome building with its classical columns is gone. In its place are houses and streets, and the ordinary infrastructure of suburban life. But look closely at the engraving and you can see something else. You can see the smoke rising from the chimneys, the visible sign of the fires that powered the machines inside. You can imagine the noise, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the shouts of workers. You can imagine the heat, the smell, the relentless rhythm of production. You can imagine what it was like to stand at the center of a revolution, to be making things that had never been made before, to be changing the world one button, one buckle, one steam engine at a time. The smoke has cleared, the noise has faded, the revolution is complete, and the Soho Manufactory sleeps beneath the gardens of South Road, waiting for someone to remember. This was the largest hardware manufactory in the world. This was where James Watt built his engines and Matthew Boulton minted his coins. This was where the Lunar Society gathered under the light of the moon to argue about chemistry and poetry and the future of mankind. This was where the Industrial Revolution was born. Now it is a row of houses in the Birmingham suburbs. The residents probably have no idea. Someday, perhaps, archaeologists will dig again. Someday the foundations will be exposed to the light, the tunnels mapped, the artifacts catalogued. Someday a museum will rise on the site, telling the story of what happened here. Someday children will come on school trips and learn about Boulton and Watt and the lunatics in the factory that changed everything. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the past will stay buried. Perhaps the houses will remain unremarkable and undisturbed for another century or two. Perhaps the story will fade further until only specialists remember that there was ever a Soho Manufactory at all. Either way, the work has been done. The engines run. The coins circulate. The principles of mass production shape every manufactured object you touch. The descendants of those steam-driven machines power the world. Boulton and Watt are on the 50-pound note, or they were until recently. And even if you never saw them there, even if you never heard their names, you are living in the world they made. That is the strange afterlife of a revolution. It succeeds so completely that it becomes invisible. It changes everything, and then everyone forgets that anything ever changed. The Soho Manufactory invented the modern world, and the modern world forgot to say thank you. But the foundations are still there, under the gardens. The bones of the factory wait in the dark, and the story, forgotten but not gone, waits to be told. What do we owe to the places that made us? What do we owe to the workers who built things we take for granted? To the inventors whose names we never learned? To the entrepreneurs whose ambitions shaped our lives? What do we owe to the dead? Maybe nothing. The dead are dead, and the past is past, and life moves forward regardless. The people of South Road are not obligated to think about the factory beneath their gardens. The citizens of Birmingham are not required to remember every vanished building that once stood within their city. History is not a debt we owe. It is simply a story we can choose to tell or not tell. But if we choose to tell it, if we choose to remember, something valuable emerges. We see that the world is not inevitable. We see that the things we take for granted were once innovations, experiments, risks. We see that ordinary people, working in ordinary places, can change everything. We see that the present is built on the past, layer upon layer, like the fill that covers the Soho Manufactory foundations. And we see, perhaps, that we too are building something. We too are making choices that will shape the world for generations we will never meet. We too will be forgotten, buried under the future, like the Soho Manufactory is buried under the suburbs of Birmingham. What will they find when they dig us up? Dusk again. South Road, Birmingham. The streetlights are coming on. Behind the terraced houses, in the back gardens, the darkness gathers. 30 feet down, the foundations wait. The drive shaft tunnel lies empty in the dark. The walls of the buckle room are still intact, holding their shape after more than a century underground. Above ground, a family sits down to dinner. A child does homework. A television flickers in a front room. The ordinary life of the ordinary present, built on top of the extraordinary past. This was the Soho Manufactory. This was where the world changed. Remember it.